Welcome to Chapter 4 in the text. We're going to talk about, in this segment, we're going to talk about the eras of policing. The book talks about three separate eras, the 1840s and 1930s being the political era, the 1930s to the 1980s being the reform era, and the 1980s to about 2001 being the community era. Also, after the 2001, we have the Homeland Security and technology era. We'll talk about that towards the end. Let's talk about the pre-political era. When the United States first formed, we were fairly rural areas, and so instead of having formal law enforcement with police officers, what we had were the people who would just watch out for each other. They called them the watchmen. Normally things went well during the day, but at night things can get out of hand, so they started having the night watchmen. Some were hired, some were just volunteers, and they would take care of the community by, if something went wrong, they'd take care of business. If they needed help, they'd start yelling and screaming, and people from the neighborhood would come out and give them a hand. That was called the hue and the cry. And that system worked until we started becoming more urbanized communities. And as communities started to grow, the need for police work started to grow, formalized police departments. So they started formalizing police departments. Again, they were mainly just the nighttime people, but they also had daytime people out there. But they were very political in that they served at the will of the mayors and the city councils, and so they did what they were supposed to do for the mayors and the city councils. Some of that was police work, making sure there was order maintained, but some of that was doing stuff like running errands for the mayor, keeping the mayor's opponents out of the way for them, stuff like that. So it was a very political era. It was one of those lower jobs that nobody would do, so the Irish were hired a lot to be police officers back then because Irish were immigrants, and you see a lot of large eastern police departments now, like New York PD, still a large portion Irish. During the political era, the police were very close to the people they served. They were walking on foot. They knew everybody in the neighborhood. They were able to do errands for them sometimes. So they was very service-oriented. And we'll talk about that as we get back to the community era, but they were very service-oriented back then. There was also some problems with the police force in the fact that they were a lot of brutality going on, a lot of drinking, some secondary stuff like selling alcohol on the side. It wasn't very professional. So in the 1920s, they formed the Wickersham Commission, the United States government did, to take a look at police work and see what kind of reforms they could do to make police departments more professional. Some of the reforms instituted by the Wickersham Commission were police academies to train the officers better, a military-type structure with ranks, including command structure, so there were more professionalism, give them uniforms. They also gave them more technology, such as motorcycles and cars. This separated the officers from those they served. They weren't on foot anymore, so it kind of distanced themselves from the community. A pioneer when it came to to reform policing was August Vollmer, Chief of Police of the Berkeley Police Department. Chief Vollmer was a pioneer in that he professionalized the police department. He required his officers to have college degrees. He also instituted a lot of scientific policing to the equation, such as using fingerprints and photographs and stuff that they hadn't done before. Instituted a detective squad so they could solve cases. Really professionalized what was going on in the police departments back then. As we entered the 1940s and 50s, there was a lot of things going on in this nation, most notably the Civil Rights Movement. And the Civil Rights Movement involved people not being treated fairly in certain segments of society, mainly African Americans, not being treated fairly by the judicial system. As such, they were protesting for their civil rights. In some areas, especially in the South, the police didn't take too well to these protests, and instead of letting people protest like they're supposed to, as long as they're doing it peacefully, they used violence to stop the protest. And this led to a lot of police brutality you see in some of these photographs here, and a distrust of the police departments. As we entered the 1960s, the Vietnam War was going on, and there was a lot of protests against that. Again, the police reacted to the Vietnam War protests with violence against the protesters, and again that built up more distrust with the people we served. There was definitely beginning an us versus them attitude in society. The federal government once again convened some commissions, most notably the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, which basically said that we, the police department, was not serving the communities that we were set out to serve, specifically those of color. If you looked at police departments in the 60s, they weren't very diverse, just like this one scene here. The police departments had women, all right, but they were mainly doing things like non-enforcement duties, parking maids, meter maids, and jail matrons. Well, later in the 70s, we started hiring more and more women in the police department and making the police department more diverse. So today, as you can see, the police department's gotten very diverse, very reflective of the communities they serve. We still kind of lack, though. It's still largely white males, but they're doing a better job. While they were making some improvements, things weren't all copacetic. We had the Rodney King beating and the subsequent riots that happened here in Los Angeles that led to a lot of more mistrust between the police and the people they serve. This was during the time I was working in law enforcement. I started in the 80s and worked through the 90s into the 2000s. During the 80s, crime rose dramatically due to drugs and other factors, but then it started to level off and started to drop. And right now in history, it's one of the lowest times in history of crime being reported. The terrorist attacks on 9/11 led us into what is now the current era of policing, the intelligence-led policing era. Law enforcement started using a lot more technology in the use of solving crime, video, audio. The Patriot Act removed some of the restrictions that were placed in the Constitution when it came to looking at terrorists. It changed the way that we do policing in the United States for the near future at least. So there you have it, the short, brief history of the eras of policing in the United States.